Thanks, Marcella. So I think with that intro, and I'd like to get into the next, the second segment of this interesting webinar, which is basically trying to, present the findings from very empirical studies on farm ponds. Try to give us a big picture. So a big picture view of farm ponds in Maharashtra and its impact. So Pooja Prasad is a postdoc in the Land and Water Department at the IHE Delft. Recently, Pooja has been awarded for her thesis, in quotes, Agricultural Intensification and Risk in Water-Constrained Regions, a Socio-Ecological Systems Analysis of Horticulture Cultivation in Maharashtra. And her presentation is going to be based on this. So first of all, congratulations, Pooja, and over to you.
Well, thank you very much, first of all, for having me here today. I'm honored to present my research here, which is going to be on the impact and use of farm ponds in Maharashtra, a more zoomed out view. Here, I want to start with a slide which shows pictures of different types of farm ponds, as we've been talking about, that there are different types and uses of farm ponds. Here we see some are dug out ponds, some are the elevated ponds, which are the focus of our discussion today. These lined farm ponds, which are used to support horticulture and are filled with groundwater. So I'm going to focus on these plastic-lined groundwater-filled farm ponds, and we know, and as we've already heard today, that there are contradictory narratives about this. There are numerous success stories that we all know about. Kadvanchi was mentioned by Shri Eknath Davle just now, about how farm ponds actually enhance farmer incomes, and especially for horticulture, and increase their drought resilience. At the same time, we've also seen presentations like the ones just made, which highlight the unsustainability of the farm ponds with respect to the use of groundwater and the increase in inequity. So my focus has been in trying to understand, okay, how do we put these sort of different contradictory narratives together to understand the system in a more holistic manner, so that we are not looking at sustainability or profitability in isolation, but can we consider how they are interconnected, how profitability, equity, and sustainability are interconnected in the system, and how they change over time. And to do that, I use a system dynamic study, which analyzes the interconnections between different stocks and flows of the system. It analyzes the different feedbacks that happens between actors. So when there are farm pond owning farmers, non-farm pond owning farmers, what is the interaction between them, how decision of one influences the other, and so on, and how the system over time changes. And this work is based on extensive field work done by me and my colleagues. But in the interest of time, I'm not going to go into the field details, as it was already, much has been said about this already. So I'm going to dive right into the system dynamic study itself. And the first part of it is a qualitative description of the structure that drives farm pond construction. So if we try to understand from the farmer's point of view, if we ask the farmers, okay, what is the reason for what drives their decision to invest in farm ponds? This causal loop diagram kind of shows what are the different feedback loops or driving mechanisms. The first one of them, I call it an aspirational intensification, or it is the aspiration of the farmer because of which they choose to invest in farm ponds, because they want to grow horticulture crops and benefit from the profitability that it offers. And when these farmers are successful, looking at them, there are more farmers who are motivated to also build farm ponds and grow orchards. So this creates a positive feedback, which leads to an increase in number of farm ponds. So after some initial farm ponds are created, more farm ponds are therefore created based on this. But as this happens, and there's more area under orchards, it leads to more groundwater demand. And we have seen how these farm ponds also lead to high evaporation loss. So there's more stress on groundwater, as we know it's a common pool resource, which then impacts the non-farm pond owning farmers. And it triggers this other cycle, which I call the vulnerability induced investment in farm ponds. So if I ask, many of the farmers will say that the reason they have invested in farm ponds is because until a few years ago, they had water in their wells sufficient to give full irrigation to their rabi kanda or their wheat crop. But lately, in the last few years, they have fallen short of 1 or 2 irrigations and have experienced yield losses. And so now, in order to have assured irrigation, they have no option but to invest in farm ponds, sometimes also by taking loans. So this is that vulnerability-induced intensification, which is driving those who are affected by increasing stress on groundwater to now also invest in creating farm ponds, which then further impacts the groundwater stress and creates this vicious cycle of more and more farm ponds being created and more increasing groundwater stress. So this is sort of the qualitative view of the structure of the system that is driving more and more farm pond construction and movement towards greater intensification with horticulture. The same sort of qualitative structure that we saw can now be simulated as a quantitative quantitative system dynamic model, which I show here. And the purpose of doing that is to see, okay, how does this unravel over time, and how is it kind of limited by the biophysical attributes of a particular system, of a particular village, because clearly it has a certain capacity of the aquifer, the shallow hard rock aquifer, and there are different rainfall patterns, sometimes a good year, sometimes a bad year. So how does it all come together when we have a hydrological system combined with a social system? So this is like a stock and flow diagram, a model that has been built for this. And what I have here is basically we can introduce different rainfall patterns, and based on the biophysical attributes of the region, there is certain groundwater capacity, the aquifer capacity. And say in this region, if we were to first start by introducing say 10 farm ponds part of a government scheme, how does it then evolve? How does the system evolve in terms of, okay, the change in the cropping pattern that results from the farm ponds? When that cropping pattern changes, how does that change the groundwater abstraction? How does it impact then the groundwater levels? How does it impact the profitability of the horticulture farmers as well as the non-horticulture farmers, and the groundwater risk or access for other farmers? And then how does that impact the decisions of other farmers to also create new farm ponds? So this feedback is now incorporated in this model, and then I run this model to look at different scenarios to understand what happens in the business as usual scenario. And I'm presenting only a couple of scenarios from this. And what I basically want to highlight is that in a typical village, if say in the first year, as part of a government program, 10 farm ponds are introduced, what this the way the feedback loops operate, we see that one introduction of farm ponds actually leads to an ever increasing number of investments in new farm ponds, first triggered by the aspiration of more farmers, and then because of the vulnerability that more and more farmers start to invest, and we see a rapid increase over a period of time. And along with this, there is a change in the cropping pattern. So initially, we may have had only say about 50% area under Rabi and no summer and orchards. But over time, we see more and more area under orchards, some area which is also summer cropping, and and reduced area under just Rabi cropping. So the more interesting part is here, where we see, okay, what happens then to the groundwater behavior and the base flows. So in the graph here, the red lines here depict the base flows, and Shri Eknath Davle mentioned about the subsurface flows and the base flows. And so it's really interesting here that we see that as the number of farm ponds start to increase, we see the impact on base flows, because that is what is actually filling up these ponds. And at a certain point, we see that these base flows disappear as the number of farm ponds increase. The blue line here shows the behavior of the groundwater, the well water level, which we also see that as there is more intensification and more farm ponds, the well levels start to sink deeper and deeper, until there comes a time when the system can no longer support, the available groundwater can no longer support the crop water demand. And so this is the carrying capacity of the system, beyond which there is unmet demand. And this unmet demand is first experienced by those who have shallow wells or who depend on the shallow public drinking water wells. But as the groundwater situation worsens, uh, eventually everybody, including the horticulture farmers, are impacted by this. And what we also see here is in terms of profitability. So if we now look at how the overall system profitability is, which includes the profitability of the orchards, growing farmers, as well as those who are only growing two crops, we see that initially, with the increase in the number of farm ponds, there is a steady increase in profitability, mainly driven by the horticulture farmers. But after that carrying capacity is exceeded, there's actually a decrease in profitability. So it's no longer even profitable to continue having more farm ponds and to continue having more intensification of agriculture. And this loss in profit is actually also seen by horticulture farmers. So what this shows is that once this carrying capacity is breached, it leads to a tragedy of the commons, in which everybody, not just the non-farm pond owning farmers, but even those who have invested in it, are going to be much worse off. Now, in this particular scenario, in this case, I haven't yet introduced droughts, the impact of droughts, just to show, just to be able to isolate what happens just because of the farm ponds. But if we actually were to introduce droughts in every, say here in the circled year, I show the number of the years in which we introduce droughts. What this shows is that with the droughts, they actually lower the carrying capacity, right? So if it's a drought year, the amount of groundwater stored in my aquifer is actually going to be much lower, and it's going to be able to support much less intensification. So even with a low level of intensification, we see that the system tips over, and there is a rapid escalation in the number of farm ponds. So this is a stylized model, but I think there are some really important learnings that we can have from this, and the implications.
Pooja, just a minute or two.
Yeah, I'm just on my last 2 or 3 slides. So the implications here are that first, in the short term, we find that yes, farm ponds do shield the early adopters, the farmers who start early with the farm ponds, from droughts. However, it triggers a vicious cycle of new farm pond creation and increasing groundwater stress for everybody, including the horticulture farmers. So the key question, which was also asked earlier, is that, okay, so is there a limit? What is the sustainable limit for intensification? Can we define this? Now, sustainable intensification inherently means that we always stay below the resource threshold. But this resource threshold is not fixed, and that is what makes it complicated. That in these shallow hard rock aquifers, it is very variable with good year and bad rainfall years. So it's actually not possible to have one fixed golden sort of number which remains sustainable no matter what kind of rainfall we have. But instead, what is possible is that we have an adaptive strategy, which is based on a seasonal carrying capacity. So if we are able to know what is my seasonal, my carrying capacity for this season, then we can decide, okay, can I fill farm ponds in this season and make use of those base flows? But if there are no base flows, then it does not make sense to fill those farm ponds. So, however, this is very contradictory actually to the current use and market incentives, which actually incentivize use of farm bonds only in drought years. And this also suggests that we need to move towards seasonally adaptive intensification. That is, we make use of good rainfall years, we grow tomatoes and horticulture in those years, but in bad rainfall years, we step back and we grow drought resilient crops. And what this means is that we must avoid being logged into a specific irrigation demand. And especially what it means is that we must stand against multi-year orchards in these regions which have very variable carrying capacity, because it locks you into having to irrigate the orchards year after year, round the year for multiple years, which farmers will irrigate no matter whether it's a bad year or good year. And so you're not able to stay within the carrying capacity. I just want to end with a couple of slides on the way forward. This is work being done by some of my colleagues in the IIT Bombay Pokhara team, which they are doing closely with the government of Maharashtra, and in trying to develop these seasonal carrying capacity maps, which can be used by the village Krishi Sahayak along with the villagers to hold a Rabi Hangam Baithak. And see, okay, what is the seasonal carrying capacity for this season, and then together be able to decide, okay, what could be a possible adaptive cropping pattern for this. So for example, this is such a map for Sengao Taluka in Hingoli, where you can see in the upstream part, the Rabi carrying capacity, and this is for current rainfall year, is 129 millimeter. And in the downstream part, we see 251 millimeter. For the same region, if we look at 2018 rainfall for a low rainfall year, we see how that carrying capacity actually changes. It can be different for different years. And that's why there's a need to then, before every Rabi sowing, to have this Rabi Hangam Baithak and sit and say, okay, this season, our carrying capacity, for example, if it's 129 millimeter, what does it mean for my cropping pattern? Maybe if I have 2 acre, I can do 100%, sow all 2 acres with just fodder crop. If I want to do harbara, sow only 50% of my area. Or if I want to do Rabi Kanda, then only do it in 1/5 of my area, right? And in a good rainfall year, I could even aim to grow tomatoes. If I want to store some part of this water in a farm pond, as long as I stay within my 250 millimeter entitlement, which is the carrying capacity for that season, then I'm not affecting other people, right? So that could be one approach to go ahead. And we hope that government of Maharashtra will come up with this GR on Rabi Hangam Baithak, just as now there is a GR for Kharif Hangam Baithak also, and that this work can go forward. Thank you for the opportunity.